Not gonna lie, guys. This is the one that almost broke me. Anxiety, hot flashes. I was a constant A-grade mess while writing this. Honestly, when I finished the first draft, I didn't know if I had made Volume 2 better or if I had made it worse. The fact that Fat Man, upon reading it, told me to immediately burn it after he finished wasn't exactly something that put my mind at ease. But I persisted. I sat down with him. We beat out a whole nother draft of it. And we had every single point almost completely fixed. There's still some flaws, but I'm very confident in what I have now. It's done. It's been vetted. It's finally ready for you to enjoy. So I present to you, folks, everyone at home, Fixing RWBY, part number 4, volume 2. Kanpai, everyone. Lord knows I need it. Damn, that's good. Alright, here we go. RWBY Volume 2. Up until Volume 5, this was the black sheep of the franchise, featuring exacerbations of issues that have plagued the series to this day, including but not limited to a desire to add more lore elements instead of expanding on old ones, a lack of narrative spine, and the continued inflation of the cast, which I'm at the very least happy to say Miles and Carrie have admitted was a failure of their early work. Like I said in my last video, they're learning, just not quite as fast as they need to in order to stop this ship from sinking. However, that's what I'm here to at least attempt today, to find a way to fix RWBY from the ground up while keeping intact as many elements as possible from the original source material. If you're new to the channel, this is following 3 other videos where I've already tackled the subjects of lore, history, and the Volume 1 of RWBY, and I'll be building off that for a framework, so if you find yourself confused, I highly recommend you look back at the other videos to get a clearer picture of what I'm doing with the series here. Also, maybe go back and watch them anyway. I put a lot of effort into them, and I don't have a lot of money these days, and the ad revenue certainly wouldn't hurt. There's an interesting quirk to adapting Volume 2 as opposed to Volume 1. In Volume 1, there were massive issues permeating the in-betweens and downtime where there could have been elaboration on important points the audience would find invaluable in understanding the world of Remnant, coupled with a distinct lack of direction that led there being no singular main plot to speak of. Sure, there were capstone episodes with Tortrick, but nothing was really accomplished in that time by our protagonists beyond getting them in the same space. That's why when I turned Volume 1 into Season 1, I decided to make it an almost entirely character-focused season over a plot-focused season. The story wasn't so much about Tortrick and the mystery behind his operation, but rather Team RWBY becoming Team RWBY. You could argue that it was the point of the actual Volume 1, but considering how little RWBY, Weiss, and Yang actually factored into Blake's subplot, I'd hardly say it was an effective way of conveying the idea. Giving them an intra-team drama and then having the 4 of them come together to beat an entertaining bad guy at the end of Season 1 seemed like the easiest solution to the conflicting plot layout Volume 1 suffered. But with Volume 2, there's actually a plot, and actually I'd say it's a pretty good plot, and in fact there are a number of good scenes that bolster that plot. But those scenes are wrecked by contradictions and poor setup. Look no further than the utterly horrendous excuse as to why RWBY and Weiss were independent at the CCT in the early sections of this volume. So the way I'm handling this particular volume has less of a focus on individual character arcs and more of a focus on core plot, with characters developing gradually as they react to the story unfolding. This means some will get more development than others and at much more varied paces, with most of the weight falling to Blake considering how integral she is in catalyzing certain plot points. Catalyzing. Now with no further preamble, let's dive into my fix to turn RWBY Volume 2 into RWBY Season 2. Right out the gate, much like Season 1, we're deviating our starting point, hacking off the whole segment with Emerald, Mercury, and Tuxum, and saving that for a rainy day. Instead, we're opening with RWBY and Yang arriving to Beacon by airship, with RWBY going off on a tangent that outlines that they've been away on break between semesters and is excited to be back, especially since she and Yang were grounded the minute their dad caught wind of what happened at the end of the last season. It's important to note that in this conversation, we'll also be establishing a gap between the end of Season 1 and the end of the first semester, so there was a brief period of time at the school that the audience hasn't gotten to see. Time has passed, and this has allowed our characters to warm up to each other along the projected paths we could see forming at the end of the last semester. Still, the conversation isn't too unnecessarily expository, mostly focusing on Yang and RWBY's sisterly dynamic. There are some jives that tie Yang's expense, since, you know, they're going to be huntsmen and the Protective Dad Act doesn't really do them any favors, but most of the conversation is centered on RWBY being annoyed that Yang was more often than not able to sneak out of their mutual grounding. It's not all sisterly bickering though, as RWBY expresses her excitement over seeing all their friends again. Blake is waiting for them at the docks, and the three have a rather warm embrace, with RWBY and Yang questioning Blake about life at Beacon over the break. Blake, having stayed at the school between semesters, comments that it was pretty nice. Ren was good company, and Nora's shenanigans kept things interesting. The three chat about some of the crazier things that went down during break, keeping a comfortable small talk going for just a while to give the audience a laugh, and then they see a Schnee Company airship landing at the docks a little further down. This is where Weiss is reintroduced to the audience, composing herself over the airship's bathroom mirror. Incidentally, this is the first time we've seen Weiss in a vacuum apart from any of the main cast, and it should be noted that her demeanor is far more relaxed than we've ever seen her before. Her back is less straight, her face isn't controlled, and she seems smaller compared to how confidently she's normally portrayed. This is Weiss more near her natural state, and it shows how much effort goes into propping up her persona among the public. With a breath, her demeanor shifts and she becomes the Weiss we know, swiftly exiting the airship. Outside, her servants are offloading luggage, and one of them, a Faunus in this instance, drops a briefcase, causing Weiss to snap at him. However, upon seeing his Faunus featured, Weiss visibly locks her jaw shut and sucks in a sharp breath. Instead of going off on a long, shrill tirade, she takes the case from the man herself and tells him to be more careful. While it's still a very curt exchange, this is the first instance this volume that we see of Weiss trying to actively fight her more racist instincts. This is an important demonstration because we the writers have heard the incredibly loud backlash over Weiss's racism, and it's more necessary to address those fears by softening Weiss's flaws while accentuating her positives. Initially, before the backlash, the plan was to wean off the racist elements of her personality gradually in the background, but by handling it this way, we're highlighting the positive of Weiss's own self-reflection and personal patience, while also not shying away from her negatives. Making her aware of her own faults and having her take an active role in curbing them goes a long way towards assuaging the audience's desires without compromising the vision of the piece. After this brief exchange, the rest of RWBY approaches, and while it's clear that they want to comment on that small little back and forth, they refrain, instead launching straight into a group hug composed of RWBY and Yang. Blake abstains, which Weiss seems to appreciate considering how irritated she is by the two sisters squeezing her to death. She greets them back, hugging them back almost against her will before presenting the three with gifts she got while in Atlas. An organizer binder for RWBY, high-end Atlesian shampoo and conditioner for Yang, and a copy of Third Crusade for Blake, a book that Blake had lost long before arriving at Beacon and had never picked up another copy of. There would be some small, sweet dialogue between them to establish that the two have managed to bond since the incident at the end of Season 1, though the bond is still somewhat strained. There's an understanding and some respect, but there's still plenty of room to grow. Blake is pleased and suggests they head to the cafeteria after they get settled back into their dorm, saying that Nora and Ren were planning on doing the same once John and Pyrrha got situated. Excited, RWBY spurs on the plan and rushes everyone off to their room so they can see their friends sooner. As they leave, in the background, we have the first appearance of Team Season, not Team Sun, who are complaining about how one of their members, Sun Wukong, ditched them before they left Mistral. They all hope their teachers manage to track him down, and they all agree to give him an earful when he finally gets to Vale. Now we finally cut to an event from the original episode, that being the cafeteria scene, and the majority of this is left completely untouched, though the bit with Weiss's binder is switched from a fourth wall breaking Nixon reference to an amazement over RWBY filling the binder Weiss gave her with best day ever ideas in such a short turnaround. There are some other small tweaks, like changing RWBY's line about students arriving from other schools to fit with the fact that no students arrived at Beacon for the previous semester. Additionally, instead of Sun and Neptune walking in on the fight, it's Coco and Velvet, who are instead talking about anxiety over 2 training missions they're going to need to go on near the end of the semester. Coco will, of course, be the one to get covered in food at the end of this, because she's the chic one. The fight itself remains as fun and goofy as it originally did in the main show, and it does a great job of showcasing all of RWBY and Juniper's talents. But in particular, when Pyrrha polarizes all of the cans in the room, there's a brief cut to Cinder outside the hall pausing to look in and watch for a brief moment, surprised to see Pyrrha's semblance. But other than that small addition, the scene continues as it did before, ominous Ozpin statements and all, and we fade out to the episode's stinger scene with Torchwick. Instead of getting a confrontation scene between Roman and Cinder, we're instead get to see the end of a successful death theft by the members of the White Fang. Roman seems to be the man in charge, charge, and he shares some words with the actual White Fang leader present, the lieutenant, who expresses his surprise and respect over how efficiently Roman operated. Roman, ignoring the low expectations, preens his feathers over the compliment and adds a self-deprecating remark that so long as children stayed out of the picture, he can work wonders. He gives his own compliment back to the lieutenant about the efficacy of the White Fang troops, remarking how much work could be done when the workforce he had was actually competent. The lieutenant waxes back that motivation other than greed is a powerful tool, and Roman disagrees, though he clarifies that there's more than one kind of greed in the world, and that selfish desires can work wonders towards motivating a man. The episode ends as they board a bullhead with their troops and take off. Episode 2 starts with RWBY enacting her best day ever, dragging all of Team RWBY, Juniper, and Coffee off to do a number of fun, silly things on campus, such as playing a whole host of video games, a scavenger hunt around the school, outdoor sports, and finally a cookout in the evening. Sprinkled through this are a number of odd character combinations to really establish that everyone involved are friends or are on their way to becoming friends. A few good examples of this are RWBY teaching Wise how to rollerblade, making jibes that she can fight in heels but can't handle a pair of skates, Coco and Pyrrha talking about some of the latest fashion that Pyrrha modeled over the break, and Yang and Ren cooking the dinner. The picnic itself is happening not too far from Beacon's docks, so when a supply ship touches down, it's not a surprise that the majority of the cast happen to catch sight of Sun Wukong jumping from the ship and being chased by guards. We go through the whole great stowaway routine, and Sun makes a break for the school. Carden, passing by, saw the whole scene unfold and does his best brick wall impression by blocking Sun and catching him, which gives the guards enough time to catch up. Sun, seeing Carden in school uniform, asks if Carden is a huntsman in training like him, saying that if Carden is, they're both on the same side, trying to appeal to Carden's sense of camaraderie in a bid to get free. Carden ain't having any of that shit, and as the guards arrive, they thank Carden for catching the flea bag, opening the floor for a slur of slurs from themselves and Carden, who joins in the taunting. When Sun tries to resist against Carden's grip, Carden punches him in response, knocking him to the ground. Sun, surprised, doesn't run away and tries to talk his way out of the situation since running away didn't work the first time. However, the guards hover over him and begin to beat him into the ground, getting a few good kicks in as Carden watches apathetically. Sun, between his aura and his training, takes the beating in stride and tries to talk them down calmly even as they slap him with their noodly legs. The majority of our protagonists watch this unfold, and Blake, triggered, stomps forward to confront them, punching one of the guards and knocking him out cold with his aura flailing and failing out. She's about to punch the other one when Yang manages to get a hold of her and pull her back, and shortly afterwards Blake calms, realizing what she's done. She's horrified she did something so terrible and is stunned to silence. The other guard calls Blake crazy just as RWBY steps in to defuse the situation, taking command and responsibility as Blake's team leader. RWBY explains that Sun is a huntsman problem and that Team RWBY will take him to Ozpin. The remaining guard asks about her dealing with Blake, as Blake did kind of commit aggravated assault, to which Yang replies, "What about her?" while slamming her fists together. Safe to say, the guard drags his buddy off and doesn't bother them again. Carden turns to RWBY, frowning, and lays down he will personally take Sun to Ozpin. Instead of arguing, RWBY volunteers to go with him, so she and the rest of the team can keep an eye on Carden's behavior. We cut to Ozpin's office, where Sun is getting a proper reprimand from Glinda, while Ozpin addresses the rest of the students that accompanied him. After he thanks them, Carden raises the issue of Blake assaulting the dock guard, and RWBY comes to her defense, laying out the full scope of the situation. Ozpin briefly calls RWBY's side of the case into question, not accusingly so, just trying to make sure she's not bending the truth or leaving out details to defend her teammate, as many leaders would. Wise surprises everyone by speaking up to support RWBY's account of events, and Wise's rather pristine reputation for honesty, blunt honesty, but honesty nonetheless, gives Ozpin all he needs. Giving Blake a very knowing look, he says he understands the situation and can turn a blind eye in this circumstance. He asks that Blake, her teammates, and Carden all take care to watch their behavior in public from now on and take into consideration how their actions reflect back on Beacon Academy. Carden is none too pleased, especially since Ozpin's statement comes off as a veiled reprimand of Carden as well. He slams his fist on the Ozpin's desk, asking how he was supposed to know Sun was a student. For all he knew, Sun was just another one of those crazy white Fang fanatics from Vytal trying to hide under everyone's noses. There's a lot of equipment worth stealing at a Huntsman Academy, and Carden doesn't want Beacon to wind up like one of the other dozen shops that have already been hit. This sets off a couple of alarms for our protagonists, who thought they managed to curb that particular problem last season, only for Carden to tell them to crack open a newspaper from time to time before he storms out of the room. The next scene happens the following day with a congregation of all the students in Beacon's main auditorium. Of course, all the Beacon students are here in attendance, but so is a large contingent of students from a number of different academies, including Team Season, who are still berating Sun for ditching them as they walk into the room. When things settle, Ozpin welcomes the students back from break, as well as all the temporary students from Shade and Haven they would be housing for the upcoming Vytal Festival tournament. He briefly explains that due to weather, Atlas's students will be arriving later that day, and continues on with a speech about cooperation between kingdoms, understanding between cultures, and peace worldwide, emphasizing that not focusing on these goals would only lead to the same disastrous conflicts that mar Remnant's history. This is effectively the first half of his speech from the end of the volume, cut and pasted here as an entrance ceremony instead of some strange, out-of-place preamble to students going off to fight their missions. All the same, when he says his last line about historical conflicts, Blake tightens her hand, crumpling a newspaper she was reading before the speech started. The following episode is pretty much the same as the original Welcome to Beacon episode, though with some very minor changes. We still open with the conversation between Ironwood and Ozpin, the tension over Atlas's fleet being present, and as an extra touch, having Ironwood mention Ozpin's role as head of Vytal Festival security, justifying his whole fleet as an additional resource to be at Ozpin's disposal. RWBY's board game is relatively inoffensive and just needs minor tweaks to establish both Sun and Neptune as new friends, with Sun strolling around to thank them for helping him when he arrived. The team is good-natured about it, though Weiss does scold him a little for breaking the law just to get to school on time. Sun takes this in stride while laughing it off, and in fact, this is where Neptune and Weiss somewhat hit it off, putting jibes and jokes in Sun's side. Blake, having been distant the whole game, goes back to the dorm. This is of course where Blake flashes back to her little chat with Ozpin, and the only serious tweak we're making here is having Ozpin distinguish that students either get into Beacon with transcripts from a registered Huntsman feeder school, or by taking an intensive exam, opening a way for students outside the kingdoms or unable to attend certain schools to get their footing in a Huntsman program. Other than that, the scene continues unchanged. This is then followed by Blake being confronted by the rest of Team RWBY, swapping out Weiss's chair shenanigans for a more heart-to-heart moment where Weiss ties in how being friends with Blake has made her question how she treats others, and how Blake should give her team a little trust with her anxieties. Blake comes clean about being anxious over the whole White Fang stealing dust thing again, worried that since they never found his body, Roman escaped to begin peddling his cover stories again, and RWBY rallies them all to investigate. RWBY of course realizes she left her board game in the library and rushes off to retrieve it, running headlong into Cinder, Mercury, and Emerald, and two unnamed unimportant students from Haven, with Cinder posing as the group's teacher and chaperone. The exchange happens much as it did in the original volume. There's a shift in direction in order to portray the three as much less menacing. Remember, the audience haven't met these characters yet outside of seeing Cinder back at the cafeteria in episode 1, so playing them off as just another group of students and potential allies will set up a nice, gentle twist for a few episodes down the line that'll set the audience off kilter. Of course, making Cinder look less try-hard menacing might be a little bit tricky, but that's what we have concept artists and character modelers for. Episode 4 is the start of the investigation mini-arc. We have the scene in Port's class to establish John's first real failure to woo Weiss, the team prepping for their investigation proper, and Sun and Neptune bursting in on them. There are two significant tweaks here, with Blake planning to confer with Tucson over where a White Fang meeting might be taking place, and a little added dialogue to pad Sun's justification for tagging along. Remember, he and Neptune are only sort of friends with Team RWBY at this point, so we need to use some of Sun's charming but pushy nature from back in Volume 1 to get them properly integrated with the team. This is also the point where Sun confirms his suspicions that Blake is a Faunus, and his laid-back attitude win him the chance to pair it off with her, especially since he doesn't mind beating up, quote, crazy cultist jerks, unquote. Weiss then drools over Neptune and the teams pair off to go where they need. When we arrive with RWBY and Weiss to the tower, the discussion is tweaked to change some of the lore for logical reasons. No longer are they going to the tower because RWBY just thought it was cool, but the Schnee Dust Company actually invested in its construction and has a permanent presence on one of its floors, an effective Schnee-themed palette swap of the communication floor we saw in the original show. This allows her to access not just digital, but also physical files to supplement her research and gives her proper justification for going to the physical location. Otherwise, their conversation is the same. They run into Penny, and RWBY ditches Weiss in order to figure out what's up with her. Weiss goes through her whole phone call routine, gets access to all the documents she needs, and gives her sister the cold shoulder, all while RWBY and Penny discuss what happened after the incident with Torchwig. Penny explains that this was her first time to a different kingdom, and while her dad was happy she was doing so well socializing, her getting involved in stopping a dust robbery kinda set off some alarms, so he had her taken back to Atlas for a brief spell. We'll later learn more, but effectively she was allowed to return so long as she had proper supervision. Supervision that mandated she not associate with any of Team RWBY. And when RWBY herself inquires as to who told Penny not to talk to them, that's when we get the scene with Ironwood and his spiffy new robots. Cue Penny being spotted and running, and the guards giving chase, and RWBY going all Prince of Persia, Sanic edition, just before getting hit by the delivery truck. Penny saves RWBY, and the episode ends on the reveal of Penny's robotic nature. The investigation arc continues in episode 5 by capping off the RWBY-Penny conversation, getting Penny removed from the equation for the upcoming fight. After coming through the scene a couple of times, I don't think there's anything offensive that needs removal or tweaking, so I'm fine with letting it stand still. I'd personally fix some of the, let's say less than stellar acting, but that applies to this whole season, and considering our theoretical framework of fixing this whole series, it would have been bad regardless. Maybe I do better directing the actors than Miles, Carey, or Monty, but this is one area of expertise I don't feel comfortable commenting on until I get my own original audio work completed. The next scene is all new, with Blake and Sun visiting Tucson to get a bead on the pulse of the White Fang. Since he's part of a miniature underground railroad out of the organization, he knows where meetings are planned to set up, and even helps organize a few people on the inside who try to deter new recruits. All the same, he tells them where the newest meeting is and to be careful. All throughout this exchange, there's some warm dialogue with Blake introducing Sun and the three conversing about casual affairs. There's a particular instance where Sun wants to prove he's literate by naming one of his favorite books, only to realize his mouth ran off without him and it's actually a children's book. Tucson laughs, of course, good-natured as he is, and mentions he's familiar with it, that it's a good one, and he lent it out to a friend for her kid to read. He has a habit of lending books out like that. With their business concluded, Blake and Sun leave the shop. Meanwhile, with Yang and Neptune, they arrived at Junior's club and shake him down for information. The setup is almost completely unchanged, but the substance of the conversation is quite different. While there's still a remark about the men that Torchwick hired from Junior never coming back, we get confirmation that Torchwick himself is very much rumored to be alive amongst the underbelly of Vytal, especially given the most recent dust steps that seem to have a signature MO. The strange thing though is that it's still technically just rumors. He hasn't been in touch with any of his normal associates, and he hasn't recruited any men from his normal sources, meaning that if he was able to pull off some of these heists, it's because someone is bankrolling him and providing the manpower. With nothing left to gain from Junior, Yang and Neptune leave. The latter half of the episode is when Blake and Sun go to the White Fang rally, and this, like many other moments, is almost completely untouched other than an increase in prominence for the White Fang lieutenant, who is on stage at all times, even if he's just kind of tucked off to the side when Roman steals the show. We increase attention when Blake recognizes him, briefly flashing back to a moment when the man was standing beside Adam, giving the audience a quick and abridged association that we can latch onto in order to increase the anxiety. Likewise, when the crowd starts moving, we don't cut away to the Yang and Neptune scene since you know it's finished, and we don't lose that narrative flow or the tension that's been mounting throughout this whole rally. Finally, Roman and Neo seem to slowly recognize Blake amongst the crowd, only for the lieutenant to step forward and recognize her most clearly. Blake and Sun, realizing their situation, start scrambling for their weapons. When the lieutenant screams Blake's name, the scene goes dark and the episode ends. Episode 6 is the culmination of the investigation arc and is primarily a long series of action sequences. With their identities being revealed, Blake and Sun draw their weapons, the White Fang members that are present being to close in through the crowd, while all of the fresh recruits are confused and somewhat alarmed. Blake, thinking quickly, tells Sun to close his eyes and loads her pistol with electrical dust, shooting the room's power breaker to make the warehouse's lights burn out in a bright flash. Faunus, having good night vision, logically have a sensitivity to sharp lighting and are momentarily blinded, and the fact that all the lights go out afterwards means everyone but Sun and Blake will need time to adapt to the settling darkness. Roman and Neo are especially disoriented, seeing as they're both human. Blake and Sun jump up to the catwalk and begin fighting their way down it, this being the first appearance of Sun's gunchucks, and tell me the image of him walking his way down a catwalk with those things against a stream of White Fang isn't amusing. During this confusion, several recruits run for the exit, at a loss for how to handle the situation, though a small smattering stay to help. Eventually, the two of them are back to one of the windows of the room, with Roman finally regaining coherence and strapping into the paladin just as the lieutenant approaches them to attack. Blake manages to hit an emergency button on her scroll as the lieutenant lunges at them, and the two barely manage to fend him off. Torchwick charges forward in the paladin, and since we've established that everyone started running off, there's no need to question whether or not he just trampled a room full of people he was trying to recruit. Blake and Sun leap out the window, and seconds later they're followed by Roman and his paladin. We cut back to RWBY, who has rejoined Weiss at the CCT and is trying to help her sort through some of the documents, though all she's really accomplishing is being a lovable doof. Weiss seems frustrated by RWBY's antics, but also a little endeared by them. That's when they get the emergency beacon that Blake sent out for both of them to snap to attention. They check where it's coming from and they see that it's on the move from a different part of town. Weiss is distraught over how far that is and how they'll never be able to clear that distance. RWBY, however, asks if Weiss has lightning dust loaded in Myrtenaster. When Weiss nods, RWBY smiles and we cut to them outside with Weiss on RWBY's back. With a prayer that RWBY's plan will work, Weiss combines the dust with her glyphs and makes a haste glyph like the one we saw used on Blake in the original version of the Paladin fight, making RWBY even faster. Combining that with her speed semblance, RWBY and Weiss are off like lightning, with Weiss comedically holding on for dear life and swearing she's never listening to one of RWBY's plans again. Over to Yang and Neptune, Yang also receives a distress call and notes how close it is. She's also worried over how much aura it looks like Blake is expending. Given how fast the tracker is showing them moving, she guesses Blake and Sun must be pushing their aura to outrun something. Neptune, looking over her shoulder, blinks and points to the dot, saying, "Hey, isn't that corner?" just as Blake, Sun, and the Paladin streak down the road past them. Yang throws on her helmet and Neptune hops on behind her and the two give chase. We catch up with Blake and Sun, who are somewhat winded from running, but keep pushing, their auras glowing around them very faintly so we can tell that they're using that to keep pace ahead of the Paladin. The chase happens as it did before, though now we have Yang getting on a scroll call with RWBY and Weiss, getting them up to speed on what's chasing Blake and Sun. We can even have Weiss trying desperately to juggle holding on to RWBY and holding on to her scroll. We see RWBY drop Weiss off on the overpass she winds up jumping off of at the end of the chase. RWBY speeds down below the overpass is set up for the rest of the team's arrival, and we fall into much the same fight as the Paladin fight in the original volume, only now with a few small touches to indicate that yes, this Paladin itself is a prototype and has a number of faulty features, most prominent being the laser targeting being disrupted by Weiss's fog. The fight ends much the same, with minor tweaks to show there's a little history between Yang and Neo now when she appears, and instead set up that Yang is the one who makes the joke about their plans falling apart, albeit somewhat self-deprecatingly. This is where Weiss accidentally lets out a small chuckle over the joke, which she is quick to try and cover up as police lights close in from the distance. We cut to Sun and Neptune at the noodle stand, wonder briefly how this old guy has so many jobs, and the episode ends. Thank you for watching Section 1 of Fixing RWBY Part 4. I'd love to give a big shout out to all of my wonderful patrons who have each helped this channel grow into what it is today. If you want to support the channel, please consider donating at patreon.com/CelticPhoenix. Remember, by donating $1 or more, you can get access to the Team Frostbite Discord server, where personalities like myself, FamtanFalling, and Tom Horan of Six Lick Productions regularly interact with our supporters. Please stick around for the next installment, and I'll catch you all on the flip side.